Imagine a city so large that it housed more people than modern-day Washington, D.C., standing silent and empty in the middle of a jungle, its stone temples swallowed by roots and vines, its plazas where thousands once gathered now home only to howler monkeys and jaguars. No war cries, no smoke from cooking fires, no priests climbing the steps of the pyramids to greet the sun. Just silence, total, complete, and haunting silence. This is not the beginning of a horror story. This is exactly what explorers found when they stumbled upon the ruins of the Maya civilization centuries after its people vanished. And the strangest part is not that this civilization collapsed. Civilizations rise and fall all the time. The strangest part is how fast it happened, and how completely we are still unable to explain it, even today, with satellites, ground-penetrating radar, and some of the best archaeologists in the world working on the case. In less than 100 years, a civilization of millions of people, spread across dozens of great cities, with towering pyramids, complex writing systems, advanced mathematics, and a calendar more accurate than the one Europe was using at the same time, simply stopped. The temples stopped being built. The kings stopped being praised. The markets stopped being filled. And the jungle took back what it had lost centuries earlier. Today we are going to walk through exactly what looked like in the Maya world during its final and most fascinating chapter, the years between 800 and 900 AD, when this civilization stood at the edge of its own ending without knowing it. And we are going to look closely at how they lived, what fed them, what they built their lives on. Finally, all came crashing down. Let us first understand the scale of what we are talking about, because most people, when they hear the word Maya, picture one lost city buried somewhere in the jungle. The reality is far bigger and far more impressive than that. The Maya civilization was never a single kingdom ruled by one king from one capital, the way we imagine ancient Egypt or Rome. Instead, it was a sprawling network of independent city-states, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own religious centers, and its own political ambitions, but all sharing the same language family, the same writing system, the same gods, and the same way of viewing the universe. At its absolute height, historians estimate that more than 40 major cities existed across this civilization, spread through what is today southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras. Some of these cities carried names that still echo through history today, like Tikal, Copan, Palenque, Calakmul, and Chichen Itza. These, not villages. These were not small settlements. These were massive urban centers, some of the largest cities that existed anywhere on the planet at that time. Tikal alone, at its peak, is believed to have housed anywhere between 50,000 and 120,000 people within the city itself, and this number does not even count smallest towns and farming villages that surrounded it and depended on it. Now stretch that number across dozens of similar cities, and you begin to understand why some researchers believe that the total population of the Maya world at its peak, somewhere around 750 AD, may have reached as high as 13 million people. 13 million human beings, living, working, farming, trading, worshipping, and building, all within a relatively confined jungle region, centuries before modern technology, medicine, or transportation existed to support that kind of population density. This was not a primitive society scattered across the wilderness. This was one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations that has ever existed, rivaling the great cities of ancient China, India, and the Mediterranean world, and complexity. And yet most people today know almost nothing about how these millions of people actually lived their daily lives. So what did daily life actually look like inside these cities? Picture waking up before sunrise in a modest home built from wood, mud, and thatched palm leaves, the kind of home that belonged to an ordinary farmer or craftsman, not a king. These homes were usually small, practical, and built to survive the heavy tropical rains that were common throughout the region. A typical family home consisted of 1 or 2 rooms, often built on a low stone platform to keep the living space above ground level and away from flooding during the rainy season. Inside, life was simple but far from empty. Families slept on woven mats, cooked over open hearths, stored maize and other food in clay pots, and kept small altars where they honored their ancestors and household gods. Outside the home, family life revolved heavily around the rhythms of agriculture and the demands of the city above them. If you walked further into the heart of any major Maya city, however, the scenery changed dramatically. Towering stone pyramids rose above the jungle canopy, some reaching heights of over 200 feet, built without metal tools, without wheels for transportation, and without draft animals to help haul the enormous limestone blocks used in construction. These pyramids were not simply monuments. They were temples, tombs, and symbols of political and religious power, all combined into one structure. Kings were often buried deep within these pyramids, and new layers were sometimes directly on top of older structures, as each ruler tried to leave behind a monument even greater than the one before him. Surrounding these pyramids were massive plazas, ball courts where a ritual sport involving a rubber ball was played, palaces for the ruling elite, and administrative buildings where scribes recorded historical events, royalages, and religious ceremonies using one of the most advanced writing systems that existed anywhere in the ancient world at that time. This writing system used hundreds of glyphs, was capable of expressing full and complex sentences, and was used to record everything from military victories to astronomical observations. The Maya were also extraordinary mathematicians and astronomers. They developed one of the earliest known uses of the concept of zero in world history, and they created a calendar system so precise in tracking the movement of the sun, moon, and even the planet Venus that it remains impressive to astronomers today. Society within these cities was sharply divided by class, and that division shaped almost every part of daily life. At the very top sat the king, often referred to using a title that translates to Holy Lord, believed by his people to have a direct connection to the gods and the ability to communicate with ancestors and supernatural forces on behalf of his kingdom. Below the king sat a class of nobles, priests, and high-ranking officials, many of whom were relatives of the royal family or powerful allies who helped run the administrative and religious functions of the city. These elites lived in stone homes near the ceremonial center of the city, wore elaborate clothing, decorated with jade, feathers, and woven cotton, and had access to the finest food, imported goods, and education. Below this small elite class existed a much larger population of skilled workers, including scribes, artists, architects, and craftsmen who created the pottery, jewelry, and stone carvings that we still marvel at today. But by far, just portion of my society, likely than 80% of the total population, consisted of farmers and laborers, the people whose daily back-breaking work in the fields quite literally fed the entire civilization and made the construction of massive pyramids and temples possible in the first place. These farmers lived a life defined almost entirely by the agricultural calendar, waking before dawn to work their fields, returning home as the tropical heat became unbearable in the middle of the day, and often returning to the fields again in the cooler hours of late afternoon. Picture what an ordinary day actually felt like inside one of these cities, because the sheer normalcy of it is exactly what makes the ending, when it comes, so hard, accept. Children ran through narrow pathways between homes while their mothers ground maize into dough, using stone tools passed down through generations. Marketplaces near the city center buzzed with noise and color, traders calling out prices for salt, cacao, cotton cloth, obsidian blades, and painted pottery, while priests in elaborate feathered headdresses moved through the crowd on their way to perform rituals timed precisely according to their advanced calendar system. Smoke rose from countless small cooking fires scattered across the city, carrying the smell of roasted maize and simmering beans through the humid jungle air. In the evenings, families gathered together, told stories about their gods and ancestors, and prepared for the next day of farming, building, or trading, with absolutely no idea that within a few generations, this entire rhythm would fall completely silent. Keep that image in your mind, because everything you are about to hear happened to real people, exactly this kind of ordinary life. It is also worth pausing on just how advanced these people actually were, because it is easy to underestimate ancient civilizations, assuming that anything built without metal tools or modern machinery must have been primitive. The Maya were anything but primitive. Their astronomers tracked the movements of the sun, moon, and planet Venus with such precision that their calendar calculations remain impressively accurate even by modern standards, and this knowledge directly guided when farmers should plant crops, when religious ceremonies should take place, and when kings should launch military campaigns against rival cities. Their mathematical system, built around a base of 20 rather than the base of 10 most of the modern world uses today, included an early and independent use of the concept of zero, something many other ancient civilizations struggled to develop at all. Their writing system, made up of intricate glyphs carved into stone monuments, painted onto pottery, and written in folded bark paper books, was capable of ordering full sentences describing historical events, royal genealogies, military victories, and religious beliefs, making the Maya one of only a handful of ancient civilizations anywhere in the world to develop a fully functional written language completely independently. All of this sophistication existed side by side with the daily struggle of farmers working in exhausted soil to feed their families. And that contrast matters, because what you are about to hear did not happen to a society that failed out of ignorance. It happened to a society that pushed the very edge of what was possible, and eventually found that edge. And this brings us directly to the single most important question in understanding this civilization, the question of survival itself. How exactly did millions of people manage to feed themselves in a tropical jungle environment that, on the surface, does not seem capable of supporting that kind of population density? The answer lies in one crop above all others: maize, or what we today commonly call corn. Maize was not simply a food source for the Maya. It was sacred. According to Maya mythology, human beings themselves were created from maize dough by the gods, which tells you just how central this single crop was to their entire worldview and daily survival. Alongside maize, farmers also grew beans, squash, chili peppers, and a variety of root vegetables, combining these crops in a way that helped maintain soilty naturally, since beans in particular helped return nutrients to soil that maize alone would otherwise deplete over time. But growing enough food to support millions of people in a jungle environment required far more than simply planting seeds and hoping for rain. It required genuine agricultural engineering. Maya farmers developed and relied upon a technique known as slash-and-burn agriculture, where sections of jungle were cleared and burned, adding nutrient-rich ash back into the thin tropical soil before crops were planted. However, this method alone could not have supported the massive populations found in cities like Calakmul or Calakmul. So archaeologists have discovered clear evidence that Maya farmers also built elaborate raised field systems in swampy lowland areas, essentially creating small artificial islands of fertile soil surrounded by drainage canals that also functioned as sources of fish and aquatic plants. In hillier regions, farmers carved terraces directly into slopes to prevent soil erosion and maximize the amount of land available for planting. And because rainfall in this region could be unpredictable, and because there were almost no natural rivers running through many parts of the southern lowlands, the Maya became remarkably skilled at water management. They built massive stone reservoirs capable of storing millions of gallons of rainwater, channeled water through carefully designed canal systems, and in some cities, engineered systems that could store enough water to sustain tens of thousands of people through several months of dry season. This was not luck. This was calculated, intelligent, large-scale civil engineering, developed centuries before similar systems existed in most of the ancient world. Beyond agriculture, trade formed the second great pillar upon which this civilization survived and thrived. No single Maya city was entirely self-sufficient, and the differences in resources available across the region meant that trade was not simply beneficial, it was absolutely essential to daily survival for cities of this size. Cities located along rivers and coastlines controlled access to salt, an essential resource for both human health and food preservation, and traded this salt inland in exchange for other goods. Obsidian, a volcanic glass used to make incredibly sharp tools and weapons, was mined in highland regions and transported hundreds of miles to lowland cities that had no natural access to this material. Jade, one of the most prized materials in the entire Maya world, considered even more valuable than gold, was traded extensively and used to create jewelry, ceremonial masks, and burial offerings for kings and nobles. Cacao beans, the raw ingredient used to make a bitter ceremonial chocolate drink reserved primarily for elites and religious ceremonies, were so valuable that they were also used as a form of currency in Maya marketplaces. Feathers from tropical birds, cotton textiles, honey, animal skins, and finely painted pottery all moved along extensive trade routes that connected Maya cities not just to each other, but to distant civilizations far beyond their borders, including powerful partners as far away as central Mexico. These trade networks created wealth, funded the construction of massive temples, supported growing populations, and connected the Maya world into a much larger economic system across ancient Mesoamerica. But these same trade networks also created a kind of dependency, because when trade routes were disrupted, either through warfare, political instability, or the decline of major trading partners elsewhere in Mesoamerica, the ripple effects could be felt across the entire Maya world, weakening cities that had grown accustomed to a steady flow of essential goods from far away. For centuries, this combination of intelligent agriculture and extensive trade allowed Maya cities to grow larger, wealthier, and more powerful. Populations steadily increased generation after generation, cities expanded further into the surrounding jungle, and rulers competed with one another by building ever taller and more elaborate temples to display their wealth and their connection to the divine. Now here is where the story takes a turn that most people never expect. Everything you have just heard sounds the description of a civilization at the very top of its game, wealthy, brilliant, expanding, and seemingly unstoppable. So if you are waiting for some dramatic outside invasion, some foreign army marching into the jungle to to burn these cities to the ground, you are about to be surprised, because that is not what happened at all. No enemy army ever conquered the Maya heartland. There was no single battle, no single event, no single villain. The Maya were not destroyed by anyone else. They were undone, slowly and quietly, by the very success that had made them so powerful in the first place. And it started with a problem that is almost invisible until it is far too late to fix. But by the time we reach the period between roughly 750 and 800 AD, something had fundamentally changed beneath the surface of this apparent prosperity, and that something was overpopulation. Archaeological surveys using modern technology, including laser mapping that can see through dense jungle canopy, have revealed that Maya cities and the farmland surrounding them were far more densely populated than anyone previously imagined. Every available piece of land, including steep hillsides and marginal soil that would normally be left unused, was being farmed, cleared, and cultivated in a desperate effort to feed growing populations. Forests that once helped regulate local rainfall patterns and prevent soil erosion were being cut down at an alarming rate, not just for farmland, but also for construction, since Maya cities required enormous quantities of wood to fuel the fires needed to produce lime plaster, the material used to coat their famous pyramids and temples in that brilliant finish visitors admire in illustrations today. It has been estimated that producing enough lime plaster to just a single square meter of temple surface required burning around 20 trees. And when you consider the sheer scale of construction happening across dozens of major cities simultaneously, you begin to understand the environmental toll this was taking on the surrounding landscape. Soil that had once been fertile became exhausted from constant use without adequate time to recover. Deforestation likely disrupted local weather patterns, making the region more vulnerable to drought at precisely the moment when population pressure meant there was less room for error in food production. Some cities had grown so large and so dependent on complex agricultural systems that they existed right at the very edge of what their environment could sustainably support. And any disruption, even a relatively minor one, threatened to become a catastrophe. And then, right around 800 AD, that disruption arrived. Scientists studying ancient sediment cores pulled from lake beds across the Yucatan region have discovered something remarkable and deeply unsettling. The period between roughly 800 and 1000 AD corresponds to the driest interval seen in this region in over 7,000 years. In other words, right at the exact moment when Maya civilization was most vulnerable, having pushed its agricultural systems and environment to their absolute limits through overpopulation and deforestation, a severe and sustained drought struck the region. For a civilization whose survival depended almost entirely on predictable rainfalls and refill their carefully engineered reservoirs, a drought of this severity and duration would have been nothing short of catastrophic. Crops failed, reservoirs ran dry, food that had once been abundant became scarce, and in some cities, evidence suggests scarce enough to cause genuine famine and malnutrition among the population. And when food becomes scarce for millions of people spread across dozens of independent, competing city-states, the result is rarely peaceful cooperation. Instead, archaeological and historical evidence shows a dramatic increase in warfare between Maya cities during this exact period. Cities that had once cooperated through trade increasingly turned against one another, fighting over dwindling farmland, water sources, and control of remaining trade routes. Monuments and inscriptions from this era, once filled with celebrations of peaceful achievements, construction projects, and royal ceremonies, increasingly began recording military conquests, captured enemy rulers, and violent conflict between rival kingdoms. This warfare would have further disrupted agriculture, since farmers pulled away from their fields to fight or flee violence, obviously not tend their crops, deepening the very food shortages that had caused the conflict in the first place, creating a vicious and self-reinforcing cycle of drought, famine, and further collapse. As conditions worsened, something else began happening that historians consider just as important as the environmental and military crisis, and that is a collapse in political and religious authority. Remember that the Maya kings ruled not simply through military force, but through the belief that they held a sacred, personal connection to the gods, a connection that supposedly allowed them to guarantee good harvests, adequate rainfall, and prosperity for their people. This belief was the invisible thread that held Maya society together, giving ordinary farmers a reason to support their king, contribute their labor to massive construction projects, and accept the enormous social inequality that existed between the ruling elite and everyone else. But when drought struck, when crops failed year after year, and when kings who claimed divine power over rainfall proved utterly unable to end the suffering of their people, that fundamental belief began to crumble. If a king could no longer deliver on the very promise that justified his rule in the first place, why should farmers continue supporting him? Why should laborers continue building temples to honor a ruler whose sacred connection to the gods had seemingly failed his people? Archaeologists have found that the construction of new monuments, temples, and royal inscriptions dramatically slowed, and then stopped almost entirely in city after city during this period, with the last dated monuments appearing in the early to mid-9th century in most southern lowland cities. This was not simply a matter of running out of resources to build with. It reflects a genuine collapse in the political and religious system that had held these societies together for centuries. The result of all these forces combining together, environmental strain from overpopulation and deforestation, severe and prolonged drought, increasing warfare between competing cities, and the collapse of the religious and political authority that held society together, was one of the most dramatic and mysterious societal collapses in all of recorded human history. Within a period of roughly 50 to 100 years, the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands were largely abandoned. Populations that had once numbered in the tens of thousands in individual cities dropped catastrophically, in some documented cases by more than 90%. Families who had lived in these urban centers for generations packed up what they could carry and left, whether driven by starvation, warfare, disease, or simply the collapse of the economic and social systems that had once supported urban life. The magnificent stone pyramids, the grand plazas, the palaces of kings who had once claimed to speak with the gods, all of it was left behind, and the jungle, patient and relentless, began slowly reclaiming what had once been some of the largest and most sophisticated cities on the planet. Vines around temple walls, tree roots forced their way between carefully cut limestone blocks. Within a few generations, cities that had once housed well over 100,000 people were reduced to overgrown hills, barely visible beneath centuries of jungle growth, their true nature completely forgotten by the outside world. It is important to understand, however, that this was not the complete end of the Maya people or their culture, even though it is often described using the dramatic word collapse. While the great cities of the southern lowlands were being abandoned, cities in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, places like Chichen Itza, actually grew and prospered during this same period, adapting to different environmental conditions and continuing many Maya traditions for centuries afterward. Maya people themselves never disappeared. Their descendants continue living throughout this region today, speaking Maya languages and maintaining cultural traditions that stretch back thousands of years. What collapsed was not an entire people or an entire culture, but rather the specific political and urban system centered around powerful kings, massive temple construction, and densely populated cities in the southern lowlands, a system that had simply grown beyond what its environment could sustain, and which shattered when drought removed the margin for error that had allowed it to function for so many centuries. For hundreds of years after this collapse, these once great cities remained lost, swallowed almost entirely by jungle, unknown to the wider world. Nature worked with astonishing speed and patience. Within just a few generations, structures that had once stood as the tallest and most impressive buildings in the entire region were reduced to strange, unnaturally shaped hills covered in thick vegetation, indistinguishable to the untrained eye from the natural landscape surrounding them. Local communities living near these ruins in later centuries often knew that something ancient lay beneath the overgrowth, passing down fragments of stories and legends about the people who had built them. But the true scale, sophistication, and history of what hidden beneath the jungle canopy remain most entirely unknown to the wider world for an extraordinarily long time. It was not until relatively recent centuries, as explorers and later trained archaeologists began pushing deep into these remote jungle regions, that the true scale of what had once existed here began to be understood. Early explorers, stumbling upon these overgrown stone structures, could hardly believe what they were looking at. Massive pyramids hidden beneath centuries of vegetation, plazas buried under jungle floor, and inscriptions written in a writing system that took modern scholars generations of dedicated research to finally decode. Entire cities were essentially rediscovered one at a time, often guided by local communities who knew of strange stone mounds hidden deep in the forest, followed by painstaking excavation work that slowly rebranded staircases, carved monuments, tombs filled with jade and pottery, and the outlines of plazas and palaces that had been completely invisible years earlier beneath the jungle floor. Decoding the Maya writing system alone took the combined efforts of researchers across multiple generations and multiple countries, a process that only reached real breakthroughs in the latter half of the 20th century, meaning that for a very long time, these magnificent ruins stood as beautiful but silent mysteries, their carved messages visible but unreadable. Even today, using advanced technology that allows researchers to digitally strip away the jungle canopy and reveal what lies beneath, archaeologists continue discovering previously unknown structures, roads, and entire settlements hidden within these forests. Laser scanning technology carried aboard aircraft flying the jungle canopy has revealed vast networks of raised roads connecting cities that were previously thought to be isolated from one another, agricultural terraces stretching across hillsides that had been completely visible from the ground, and entire smaller settlements that had never before been documented by researchers, suggesting that the true population and complexity of this civilization may have been significantly larger than previously estimated. Every single one of these new discoveries adds another piece to an enormous and still unfinished puzzle that is really the point worth sitting with here. We are not looking back at a finished story. We are looking at a mystery that is still actively being solved, piece by piece, in real time, using tools that did not even exist 20 years ago. And maybe that is the real reason this civilization still grips people the way it does. It is not just that they built extraordinary cities in the middle of a jungle without metal tools or wheels or animals to help them. It is that a society this brilliant, this tracking planets and inventing mathematics and building reservoirs that could sustain of thousands of people through months of, still could not the slow, quiet danger it was building for itself. One cleared forest and one crowded field at a time, until the rain simply stopped coming and there was nowhere left to turn. It is a warning written in stone, buried in a jungle, waiting more than 1,000 years for anyone to be able to read it. And now that we finally can, the question worth asking is not just what happened to the Maya. It is whether we would even recognize the same warning signs if they were happening around us right now.